Hi, I'm Vernon. Today we're going to talk about 5 things a woman should never do for a man, no matter how much she loves him. At this age, you start to see patterns. You've lived through enough to know that not all giving is good, and not all love is true. Too many women, especially those with kind hearts, carry the weight of relationships on their backs. They bend, they compromise, they give until there's nothing left. But here's the truth. The more you sacrifice your dignity, your voice, or your sense of peace to please a man, the more he drifts away. Not because he's cruel, but because he no longer feels the need to reach for you. The mystery fades. The respect erodes, and without respect, love cannot hold. This isn't about pointing fingers. It's about protecting the space within you that makes you lovable in the first place. When you give that away too easily, you take away his reason to cherish you. If this message resonates with you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Not just to support the content, but to help more women like you hear what they may have needed decades ago. Every click keeps the wisdom flowing. Let's dive into about it, because understanding what not to do is often the beginning of doing better, not just in love, but in how we carry ourselves forward. 1. Never sacrifice your dreams for a man. There's a quiet kind of giving that many women know too well. Not the giving of time or care, but the giving up of their own dreams, quietly laid aside for the sake of someone else's path. My mother was one of those women. She was a brilliant woman, quick-minded, artistic, full of ideas. In her 20s, she dreamed of opening a small bookshop by the coast. Something quiet, peaceful, a space that smelled of paper, sea breeze, and possibility. But life, as it often does, had other plans. She married young, raised 4 children, held the household together like the spine of an old book, steady, quiet, irreplaceable. She managed the bills, the noise, the mess, and my father's tender pride. And every time that little dream of hers, the bookshop by the sea, tried to speak, she silenced it with the same soft refrain. It's not the right time. Maybe next year. He needs me more than I need this. It wasn't bitterness that crept in. It was something gentler, but heavier, a quiet folding of her own voice. And in watching her, I learned something few men are ever taught, that when a woman gives up too much of herself in love, she doesn't just lose pieces of her dream, she teaches the world and the man beside her to stop asking what she wants. Years passed. The shop never came. The dream dimmed, not with resentment, but with resignation. And though she never complained, I saw it in the way her eyes lingered on bookshop windows, in the way she stayed quiet during conversations about purpose and passion. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre said, "Commitment is an act, not a word." And yet many women commit to everyone else's life, but their own. In the name of love, they let go of the very things that make them feel alive. But here's the quiet truth. When you give up your purpose, you don't draw a man closer. You slowly become invisible to him, not because you're not worthy, but because you stop showing him the fire that made you radiant in the first place. Love doesn't require you to shrink. It asks you to rise and to invite your partner to rise with you. So keep your dreams in view. Nurture them. They are not selfish, they are sacred. And the man who truly loves you will never ask you to choose between him and yourself. In fact, he'll stand beside you, steady and quiet, helping you build the life that lights you up. Not because he needs to control it, but because he finds joy in watching you come alive. Because when a woman honors her own path, she not only becomes more visible to the world, she becomes magnetic. And sometimes it's not what you give up for love that defines the relationship, but what you choose to keep. 2. Never apologize for your standards. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." Standards, real ones, not checklists, are tied to your why. They are not walls to keep love out, but filters that keep your soul intact. Yet time and again, I've seen women apologize for expecting too much, for asking to be treated with consistency, with presence, with honesty, as if wanting emotional safety was some kind of flaw. But here's the thing, standards are not demands. They are quiet signals we send to the world about how we expect to be treated. They form the emotional scaffolding that holds our worth in place. To lower them in order to keep someone close isn't an act of love, it's an act of quiet self-abandonment. Psychology tells us that attachment formed without boundaries often leads to resentment or emotional dependency. You may think you're choosing connection, but what you're often choosing is invisibility. Because the moment you erase your own needs, you're no longer relating, you're disappearing. A man who truly respects you won't feel burdened by your standards. He'll feel honored to meet them. And if he doesn't, then it was never about you, it was about his readiness. It takes strength to hold to your values in a world that constantly tells women to settle. But settling doesn't bring peace. It brings silence, the kind that grows louder with time. And if this is resonating, go ahead and tap the like button. It lets me know this kind of reflection matters, and it helps share the message with someone else who might need it too. The older we get, the more we realize love without standards is not love. It's permission for someone to treat you however they please. So no, don't apologize for wanting depth. Don't shrink from your own expectations. The man who's meant for you will not only understand your standards, he'll be grateful they exist. Because how we allow others to treat us often starts with the quiet lines we choose to hold or to blur. And that brings me to something softer but just as important. Something many women offer in the name of love, but often at the cost of themselves. 3. Never chase a man's attention. There is a kind of stillness in a woman who knows her worth. A quiet, effortless presence, like a candle that doesn't flicker for the wind. She doesn't chase. She doesn't beg. She simply is. When a woman begins to chase a man's affection through overgiving, over-texting, or over-accommodating, she steps out of her natural center. And the tragic irony is, the more she reaches, the more he retreats. It's not cruelty, it's instinct. Because desire doesn't respond to desperation. It responds to energy, to mystery, to self-containment, to that subtle glow that says, I choose to be here, but I do not need to be. The Stoics believed that what is truly ours cannot be taken by force or fear, and that includes love. When you are deeply rooted in yourself, you no longer fear rejection, because you know your value is not dependent on someone else's recognition. A woman anchored in her own self-worth doesn't scramble for attention. She radiates a kind of quiet certainty that speaks louder than words. True femininity isn't loud, and it doesn't chase. It doesn't beg to be seen. It allows itself to be revealed. And that kind of presence draws in what is aligned and lets go of what isn't. Because when a woman contorts herself to be chosen, she stops being herself, and what's left is no longer her, but a version built on fear. It's in that grounded stillness, in the refusal to perform, that a woman becomes irresistible. Not because she tries, but because she doesn't need to. In truth, most men don't fall in love with the woman who runs after them. They fall for the woman who walks steadily beside her own path, who invites but never pleads. And if these words feel familiar to you, if you've ever lost yourself in the effort to keep someone interested, I gently invite you to pause this moment and like the video. It's a simple act, but maybe it's your first step back to center. The heart of feminine strength is not in pursuit, but in presence. The more you turn inward, the more you nurture that quiet light within, the more the right man will feel drawn, not out of duty, but out of genuine respect and desire. You are not meant to chase love. You are meant to become it. And perhaps the most profound part of that truth is this. When you finally stop running toward something, you begin to remember what it feels like to stand still and be whole. And from that stillness, we can now turn to something even more subtle and often more dangerous. 4. Never make yourself smaller to keep the peace. Peace is not the absence of conflict. True peace is the presence of truth, even when it trembles. There is a habit many women carry deep in their bones, the habit of silence. Not the powerful silence of self-possession, but the shrinking kind, the one that swallows opinions, softens truths, and holds back tears just to avoid rocking the boat. We are taught early to be agreeable, to not make things difficult, to keep the atmosphere light. But what often begins as grace slowly becomes self-erasure. And before we know it, we are dimming our light so others don't feel blind beside it. But here's what's often missed. A relationship that requires your silence to survive was never built on love. It was built on control. And the more you withhold your truth, the more you teach someone that your boundaries are negotiable. If that feels familiar, save this video. Not just for now, but for the quiet nights when you need a reminder of what your voice is worth. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But you cannot become anything real while walking on eggshells. The man who is right for you will not be afraid of your truth. He may not always agree, but he will welcome your voice, even when it's inconvenient. Because intimacy is not about harmony at all costs. It's about honesty without fear. So speak, not to start a war, but to make space for your full self to exist. And if this part strikes a chord in you, if you've been quietly holding back just to keep someone comfortable, consider liking this video. Let it be a gentle promise to yourself that your truth deserves air, not apology. When you stop making yourself smaller, you stop attracting those who expect you to shrink. And in that space, something better begins to grow. A love where you no longer have to whisper to be heard. Because once you reclaim your voice, you begin to see more clearly, not just who truly listens, but what you've been keeping quiet for too long. And that leads us to one final truth, perhaps the hardest to accept, yet the most freeing of all. 5. Never give him the power to define your worth. Letting someone else become the mirror through which you see yourself is one of the quietest dangers in love. It feels like devotion, but often leads to disappearance. When a woman starts to believe that her value depends on how much a man loves her, how much he praises her, stays with her, or chooses her, she hands him the pen to write her identity. And that is a story that will never end well. Love, when it's healthy, reflects us, but it should never be the sole mirror we rely on to understand who we are. I've seen this up close, not just through the people I've counseled, but through the woman I now share my life with. My wife once told me that in her first marriage, she began to measure her value by how her husband responded to her. A good day meant she felt beautiful. A distant glance meant she questioned everything about herself. She didn't notice it at first, how the slow erosion of self begins not with harsh words, but with subtle silences. Over time, her confidence became tethered to his nudes. And by the time she realized it, she wasn't sure where he ended and she began. That experience taught her something powerful. That the moment you hand someone else the authority to define your worth, you'll spend your life chasing their approval and calling it connection. What she reclaimed, slowly, painfully, was the understanding that real love doesn't ask you to shrink in order to fit inside someone else's view of you. It invites you to expand. You can love someone deeply and still know your worth without their validation. In fact, that's the only kind of love that lasts. In the words of the poet Rainer Maria Rilke, the only journey is the one within. A woman must know who she is before anyone else has a chance to tell her who to be. Because when a man senses that you need him to feel whole, something subtle shifts. The dynamic becomes uneven, and love turns into validation seeking. But when you walk into a relationship already knowing your worth, already full, you don't cling, you choose. You don't beg, you discern. You don't fear loss because your value doesn't waver with someone else's presence. So don't let any man, no matter how charming or constant, become the scale you weigh yourself on. Now is the moment when wisdom turns inward. Real love doesn't require you to vanish. It doesn't demand that you dim your light to be worthy of staying. These 5 reflections, drawn not from theory but from lived experience, are reminders that your value doesn't increase when you give more of yourself away. Trust me, women who receive the deepest, most lasting kind of love are often the ones who've learned what not to surrender. This isn't about being hard, it's about being clear. About knowing that love without respect, without space, without voice, is not love at all. What you withhold out of self-respect often protects the most sacred parts of who you are. And that, in the end, is what makes you unforgettable. No one gets it perfect. We learn by living, by falling, by reflecting. As Socrates once said, an unexamined life is not worth living. And perhaps a love that asks us to forget ourselves is not worth staying in. What matters most is that you come back to yourself again and again, stronger, wiser, and more whole. If this message spoke to something in you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. It helps this kind of honest reflection reach more women who might be searching for it right now. Until next time, stay rooted in who you are.